So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is just to say a very few warm words of welcome to all of you, and actually to very, very briefly introduce Timothy Snyder, my colleague of many years standing here at the IWM, who actually needs no introduction. But I felt, since this is a slightly formal occasion, this is the first of 3 lectures which Tim is giving, 2 at the IWM and 1 together with my other colleague, Matti Bunzel, at the Wien Museum. This is the book presentation of Tim's new book, Black Earth, which will be presented at the Wien Museum. I thought I should take the opportunity not only to thank Tim for agreeing to do the 3 lectures for us, but also to do it at relatively short notice. Tim Snyder, as most of you know, is the Bert Whiteman Housum Professor of History at Yale University. He has been a permanent fellow of the Institute and has been a very, very active member of the intellectual community Institute with his research program on United Europe, Divided History. His work, which is part of that program, has been an intervention, and a very important intervention in my view, into narratives of the past in Europe, narratives which are not only shared, but are dividing us increasingly, particularly as we see in many, many countries in Europe today a trend towards a narrower nationalistic and ethno-nationalistic history. So this is a program which not only is intellectually extremely important for us, but I think has enormous political implications and significance. Among many of Tim's book, I'm just going to mention 3 or 4. Not only are they, all of them, award-winning books which have been translated into several European languages, but I think 3 of them have been written here at the IWM. So actually, we can claim much more of an association with Tim and his work through this extremely important scholarship. Bloodlands, as many of you know, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, is a history of the Nazi and the Soviet mass killings between Berlin and Moscow, geographically, so to speak. It has received a number of prizes, including the Hannah Arendt Prize for Political Thought in Germany, the Leipzig Prize for European Understanding, and the Ralph Waldo Emerson Award in the Humanities. I think to date it's been translated into 20 languages. Black Earth, which is going to come out very soon, next month, in September. Black Earth, the subtitle is Holocaust as History and Writing. It's a very hard look at the intellectual origins of the Holocaust. Here again, in fact, to look back, of course, Tim is a historian who is making several arguments, but I just want to underline one very, very important argument of the book, which is to say that the genocide of Jews was premised on the destruction of states and of political institutions. And I think this is a reminder in our times today, with many increasingly fragile states which are needed for the protection of minority rights, such that this look back into history is a very, very timely reminder, such that we need to think of, it is a powerful reminder of the continuing threat that we face here. The 2 other books where there is also an association with the Institute, 2014, the edited volume with Ray Brandon, Stalin and Europe, Imitation and Domination, 1928 to 1953, is a result of conferences here at the Institute. And of course, the book which all of you will be familiar with, the book which he wrote with, helped write with Tony Judt, who was also a non-resident permanent fellow at the Institute, which is a thematic intellectual history of Europe called Thinking the 20th Century. So there are many, many ways in which Tim has been associated extremely closely with the Institute, and it's a great pleasure that you're going to be talking to us this evening. The title of tonight's talk is Modern European History, a Global Framework from Eastern experience. And this East is Ukraine, the area which has been in the center of Tim's attention for the last few years. The general title of his work, of the two lectures taken together, is Ukraine, Russia and Europe, Past and Future. Okay. Thank you, Tim.
So thank you very much, Shalini, for the kind introduction. For all of the reasons that Shalini gives, it's a special pleasure for me to be able to give this lecture at the IWM. I'm grateful to Shalini and my colleagues for the introduction. I'm grateful to the staff at the IWM for making this event possible, but also in general for making all of the very different endeavors that we carry out here at the Institute possible. And reflecting upon this lecture, I was thinking of all of the lectures under this title that I attended over what is now not years, but decades. I look at Charles Taylor, that's more decades, I admit, but it's now been decades since when I've been attending lectures at the IWM. So it's an especially personally important occasion for me. What I'd like to try to do here is to reflect on a relationship between present and past. Begin to reflect on the question of how the present can help us think about the past. Because of course, as historians, we're always in this paradoxical position that we live in the present. I mean, our lives might not be that interesting, but we live in the present and we write about the past. And it's foolish to deny that the way that we think about the past, or the way that we order or reorder, conceive, reconceive the past, is not affected by the dramatic experiences of our own lifetimes. Now, for me, as Shalini was kind enough to mention, and as this institute has also been witness to, one significant focal point of contemporary history for a lot of us has been the revolution, counter-revolution war in Ukraine since 2013. And what I would like to do this evening is to reflect with you in a couple of different ways about how this event might help us to think through problems in European history. As you'll probably know, the good people who are in crisis management have the idea that every catastrophe is an opportunity, right? And in some sense, when you live through a historical caesura, which is, I believe, what we are doing now, I believe this is the end of the post-Cold War era that we are living through. When you live through a historical caesura, you have a chance to think through what the period should be, what the ways you should think about the past might be. Now, given that general claim, how might we go about this more particularly? Where in particular in all of these events, revolution, counter-revolution, war, where might we find a standpoint from which we can begin to think about the past? Let me suggest a couple of things. The first is this. The Ukrainians, if you can remember all the way back to November, December of 2013, January of 2014, the revolution in Ukraine, this was not the first European revolution. There was a French Revolution, there was a Bolshevik Revolution, there have been a number of revolutions in Europe. I would submit the Ukrainian Revolution was an event on a similar scale. It mobilized 1 million people, it overturned a regime, it led to a European war, it may yet bring down an entire European order. It's a revolution. But it's not the first European revolution, but it is the first revolution made by people carrying the EU flag, right? When people think of people in Europe carrying the EU flag in mass protests, we generally imagine them stamping on it, burning it, and so on, putting it in envelopes and mailing it to Washington, D.C., that sort of thing. But this was a revolution which was made by people carrying the European flag. It was made by people who claimed, against a wall of misunderstanding and distrust, that what they were actually doing was fighting for Europe. Now, our late friend and the founder of this institute, Krzysztof Michalski, in his beautiful final book on Nietzsche, The Flame of Eternity, started from the following very interesting methodological principle. Krzysztof said, if you're writing about a philosopher, you have to assume that he or she is right, and then move forward. Assume that he or she is right, and then move forward. So let's do this for just a moment. Let's assume that those Ukrainians, some of whom were hurt or killed, or who lost loved ones in the succeeding months and years, let's assume for a moment that they were right. Let's assume for a moment that they were right, that their revolution was not so much about Ukraine, and much more, in fact, about the European order. How could that be true? Okay, now I'm going to submit to you that for a historian, this is a comparatively easy one. That is actually rather a softball. It is quite easy to look at European history and to say, yes, you can add Ukraine at basically all of the typical periods and get something which is familiar and yet more interesting. So the obvious way that a historian can answer this question is to say, yes, all of the periods of European history, or depending on what kind of curriculum you came through, all of the periods of Western civilization that we know, all of them in some way or another include Ukrainian history. Or we can include Ukrainian history in them and make them seem more interesting than they were. So for example, the history of the Christian conversions at the beginning of the Middle Ages. In the Ukrainian case, you have someone, or in the case of the East Slavic lands of the state called Kievan Rus, which was centered around the city of Kiev. In this state, you have the case of someone whose name was Volodymyr, who according to the Arabic sources was a recovering Muslim, who according to the Slavic sources was a pagan, considering whether he should convert to Eastern or Western Christianity, hobbling back and forth multiple times, finally apparently converting to Eastern Christianity, although we're not entirely sure, because the first sources are from 2 centuries later. This is fairly typical. It's also fairly interesting, arguably more interesting because the backdrop against which it takes place is something that you don't see every day, even in the early Middle Ages, which is a Viking Jewish condominium. The state, I think it's generally a good idea to have Viking Jewish condominia. They lead to all kinds of good things, one of which is East Slavic history. But the Kievan Rus was a trading state, which was founded by Vikings, who were doing a very sensible thing. They were trying to create a trade route from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. If you think about it, just the Mongols in reverse, right? Not the land route from west to east, but the sea route from north to south. And Kiev is right smack in the middle. And when they arrived in Kiev, the government, the regime that then existed was something called the Khazar Khanate. And the Khazars were also in the midst of a complicated religious situation. For 9 centuries now, we debated whether they converted to Islam, Christianity, or Judaism. It now appears that they converted to Judaism, right? You're at the edge of your seat, aren't you, right? Judaism. So there was actually briefly a Jewish state between the fall of Jerusalem and Israel, in case anyone was worried. You could also count the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast currently, if you wanted to. I knew you'd be an easy mark for this stuff. But so there was a Jewish state, but right after the conversions of the Khazars to Judaism, they disappear from history. Their state is merged into this Kievan unit. So what I'm just trying to say is that there's a European landmark, the conversion to Christianity, which has all kinds of interesting elements if you look at it from an East Slavic or what you might call Ukrainian point of view. Likewise with medieval law, in Kievan Rus they codified law in a language called Chancery Slavonic. The law that they codified in Chancery Slavonic survives for about 6 centuries. Because after the fall of Kievan Rus, after the arrival of the Mongols in circa 1241, that language and that law is inherited by something called the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which for quite a long time is the largest state in Eastern Europe. And although that's a pagan state, and although its rulers speak Lithuanian, they use this Slavic language with Cyrillic alphabet for their law and as their language of court for rather a long time. Which reminds me of another great theme, maybe the great theme of European history, which is the encounter of cities with nomads, right? Because what else is the fall of Kievan Rus but the encounter of cities with nomadic peoples, i.e. the Mongols, who get as far as Kievan Rus and a little bit further, and that's one of the great lines of European history, of course, how far the Mongols come, where they are stopped, right? If they'd gone a couple states further to the west, things would be very different. So, and you can go on and on. So all of the landmarks that we find familiar, you can also find if you look at Kiev. Take the Renaissance, for example. The Renaissance comes to Kiev. It comes at a point in time when Kiev is a major city of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is a state which is formed from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Polish Kingdom in 1569. It's an extremely interesting Renaissance state because there was, so to speak, no naissance, right? It was outside the realm of classical civilization, and yet nevertheless they managed to have a Renaissance without anyone calling their bluff, essentially. The civilization of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Commonwealth was in Polish and in Latin. And then when an academy was established in Kiev, the Kiev Mohyla Academy, the languages of instruction there were Latin, Polish, Latin, and Greek. Those were the languages of instruction. By that time, it was essentially what we would think of as a Baroque curriculum, but nevertheless, it's a nice example of the Renaissance moving to the east. And so when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth falls apart, when Kiev becomes part of the Russian Empire, a state which is formed quite a bit later, that Kiev Mohyla Academy is the largest educational institution in Muscovy, which is pretty easy because there aren't any in Muscovy at the time. But so it forms the educated elites of Muscovy, of what will later become the Russian Empire. Ditto with the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. You're taking my point here. You have religious wars in Ukraine after 1648, multi-sided and complicated. But before that, you also have a Reformation and a Counter-Reformation, which is extremely interesting because multi-sided, right? I mean, I realize that the Reformation in Germany seems complicated, but you're dealing with multiple varieties of Protestantism plus Roman Catholicism. In Ukraine, all of the people from the more obscure varieties of German Protestantism, they all run to Ukraine because of the religious tolerance. They all set up with Ukrainian, I almost said oligarchs, but I mean magnates. They all set up with Ukrainian magnates, the aristocrats, large princes, for whom tolerating small Protestant denominations was a way of demonstrating how tolerant they were, but also how powerful they were, because the kings were generally Roman Catholic. And so being Orthodox, as these princes were, and sheltering small Protestant denominations was a way of demonstrating your own autonomy, right? So a great family such as, the Ostrowskis, Konstantin Ostrowski to take example, he was Orthodox. He had the first Bible printed from beginning to end in Chancellery Slavonic, in Church Slavonic, of course, and he sheltered Unitarians, right? There was also a mosque and a synagogue on his property, incidentally, which is another thing that one could say about early modern Ukraine, which is interesting and this would be a more contemporary interpretation. Early modern Ukraine is a bit like the Ottoman Empire, a place where you find this early modern model of toleration, where the state is relatively weak. It relies upon local estates or local religious leaders, if you like, to gather taxes and to generate armies. This has certain tensions, but it's different from the modern state. One of the ways it's different is that it embodies a kind of de facto toleration. So the last example I want to give, trying to make Ukrainian history seem familiar, and by the same token, making European history, which is familiar, seem more interesting. The last example one could give would be the national question. So arguably, the style of nationalism that one begins to see in Serbia in the 19th century is already present in the Cossacks in Ukraine in the 17th century, a distant warrior class that begins to define itself religiously and politically against the center, fights some wars on its own, gets itself into trouble, and so on. They had certainly some kind of national consciousness, but be that as it may, in the 19th century, nationalism proceeds on the territories of what is now Ukraine, much the same way as it proceeds elsewhere. There's romanticism in the 1820s and 30s, starting not in Western Ukraine, as everyone might think, but in Eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv. You have all of the stages of national revival, with the exception of a state at the end of it, which is going to be a major subject, including what I think is an incredibly interesting debate between two great figures, and I promise these will be maybe the last two unknown Ukrainians I'll mention. But there's a school of populist history founded by someone called Mihailo Hrushevsky, who argued that the object of history and therefore the subject of historiography were the people on the territory, the Ukrainian-speaking people. Right, this is how you had a history, because you had continuity of people. And he was opposed a bit later by a very clever political thinker called Vyacheslav Lipinski, who argued that history was in fact all about states, just like our enemies say. If we want to have a Ukrainian state, what we have to do is create a Ukrainian elite. And this means bringing in the Russians, the Poles, the Jews, whoever wants to come, right? Creating a state is a matter of political attraction. It's not a matter of some kind of historical continuity. So this debate, which in a way you can recast it as a very contemporary debate in Ukraine today, or for that matter, and throughout much of Europe today, is also already going on in Europe in the 19th and in Ukraine in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm trying to say is that one thing you could do with the Maidan and with the European flags, and with the claim that this is all about Europe, is that you could take what's familiar about European history. You could take these very conventional stages of European history, the medieval, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, religious wars versus toleration, national revivals, Romanticism, all of these things which are familiar, you could take them and you could add Ukraine in and you'd get a better textbook. Okay, so that's one thing you could do. Lecture, however, is not over because there's something else that you could do. Marion, I wonder if we prop that door open just a tiny bit, whether that would help some air come through. Thank you. So another thing, that we could do is a bit more radical, okay? Because let's take a step back and remember where I began. I began with this idea that the Ukrainians claimed that their revolution was all about Europe, and we were going to assume that that's right and see what happens. Okay, but things are a bit more interesting than this. Because not only did the Ukrainian revolutionaries claim that what they were doing was all about Europe, the Russian elites who opposed them also claim simultaneously that what they are doing is also all about Europe, right? So the Ukrainian revolutionaries on the Maidan and the Russian elites in the Kremlin who made war against Ukraine in response to the Maidan, they agree about relatively few things, right? There's a long list of things on which they do not agree. There is a short list of things on which they do agree. I think it's one item. And that one item is that this is all about Europe. And so let's take another step. Let's assume that both the Ukrainians and the Russians are right, and that this is all about Europe. And let's ask ourselves how they could agree on this point. And I think they agree on this point because the Ukrainian revolutionaries, I'm making up these groups for the point of convenience, but the Ukrainian revolutionaries and the Russian elites share a political theory about the European Union, which I don't think we even now have to assume. I think we can actually just claim is correct. A basic political theory about the European Union, which you need not notice inside the European Union, right? I mean, any more than I need not notice that whatever, America's an oligarchy. You need not notice, okay, I just noticed, I guess, but you need not notice this. You may take it for granted. The basic subliminal constitutional patterns of a political order can generally be taken for granted. I think from the outside, though, they are sometimes visible. So what is the analysis that President Putin shares with the average Ukrainian university student who risked his or her life on the Maidan? This is the analysis. The analysis is the European Union props up nation states. Okay, so from inside the European Union, you whine and you moan about how the European Union makes, Ausländer, 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 right? You moan about how the European Union restrains your sovereignty and so on. But most of this, to put it sort of bluntly and maybe a little bit brutally, most of the states in the European Union probably wouldn't exist as such without the European Union or something like it. And you're going to get, you may get to test this proposition sooner than you think. But from inside the European Union, the major complaint is how it constrains our sovereignty. But in fact, what the European Union does is that it takes smaller and bigger states and it gives them a pro forma and to a large extent also pro jure equality, which is unattainable otherwise. It actually privileges the state. It's a kind of affirmative action for small states. And this is the second part of the theory. What the European Union does is that it allows civil society, right? It allows civil society to function across borders, and it allows civil society to work, as it were, against its own state. It allows civil society to use the European idea, European norms, European institutions, the European economy in different ways as a way to strengthen the state, which is what happens in Eastern Europe after 1989. After 1989, you have a whole bunch of weak states, quite weak states actually, which are now, in some cases at least, rather robust states, which would not have happened without the European Union. So to put it more generally, what you have in the European Union is a three-part model of politics. This is so simple it may not qualify as theory, so I'm sorry to any of you actual political theorists out there. You have a three-part model of politics, which is civil society on the bottom, the state in the middle, and the international organization, the European Union, on top. And the basic idea is that the state is strengthened by both the top level and the bottom level. From the Ukrainian point of view, or from the point of view of Ukrainians on the Maidan, this was a very good thing, because we, civil society on the bottom, are going to use Europe the European Union at the top, to strengthen the state, which is corrupt and weak. That is the basic idea. We have corruption, we don't have the rule of law. The only way to get it is an association agreement with the European Union, which explains why otherwise perfectly normal university students would risk their lives for a trade agreement, right? Because they get that it's not just a trade agreement, they get that it's a mechanism for making the state more robust. The other people who get that are a couple thousand kilometers away in Moscow. The normative spin in Moscow is, of course, different. The normative spin is civil society is not real and should be crushed, and international institutions, also not real, should be crushed. The thing which exists is the state. But the normative analysis is different, but the positive analysis is the same, that the European Union exists, it has these three layers. Ukrainians want to exploit them, Russians want to get, not all Russians, Russian leaders want to get rid of them, and then move us back to a world in which there are only states, bigger states, smaller states, some states cease to exist, okay? So that is the basic political theory. And so if we make this move again, and we say, let's assume that this is right. And I will just say now that for me, this is not a theoretical exercise. I actually think that is correct. I think that is, broadly speaking, correct. That is, in other words, there's something that I share with like the average, university student in Kiev plus Vladimir Putin, right? I think this is actually, this analysis is correct fundamentally. If we assume that it's right, what can we then say about European history? Where would this lead us in European history? And this is the door that I actually want to push open, because I think there's something more interesting that we can do in the present moment than just say Ukraine can decorate conventional European history or conventional European history can decorate Ukraine. I think there's a much more interesting move to be made. And that move is to take the Ukrainian-Russian encounter of today and use it to open up European history to global history, use it to break down the barriers between European and global history, and in this way find a way to make European history make sense. Okay, give me about 25 minutes and I'll show you how this can be done. So the first thing to think about here is a kind of rethinking of the 20th century, which I'm going to do in an extremely schematic way. So let's rethink the history of the 20th century using slightly different categories. The rhetorical move that has to be made right at the beginning to make the sort of the house of cards fall down and give you the cards again so you can build another house of cards for somebody else to knock down later. The first thing you have to do is you have to break down the barrier between colonial and decolonial history, which usually means Europe colonial, rest of the world decolonial. The moment that you're ready to say that colonial decolonial is not Europe, the rest of the world, but it's just colonial decolonial, and forget about Europe being different, then you're on to something which I think helps you understand all of Europe in the 20th century and gets us right back up to Russia and Ukraine. Okay, I keep magnifying these claims. Let me try to defend them. Think about the way the nation state comes about in the European 20th century. Think again about the early nation states of Europe, by which I do not mean France, which is a very special case. We all like to identify with France as paradigmatic. Okay, let's admit it. We identify with France as paradigmatic. Why? They dress well, their food is wonderful, they make universal claims, right? And it's precisely the universalism which makes France less important, because ironically, the universalism of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars is something which cannot be and is not repeated. Meanwhile, at basically the same time, the Serbs are doing something which I think is, this is the part where like the French colleagues get up and walk out, but I think is actually more world historically important, which is that they create, they create a model which I would submit spreads not only through Europe but throughout the world over the course of the next couple hundred years. In the first third of the 19th century, the Serbs create what I would call the decolonial model, which we otherwise known as the nation state. Anti-imperial rhetoric, ethnic arguments about statehood. When statehood is achieved, a basic problem of political economy, which is that you're way too small. You only have, in this case of the Serbs, you only have agrarian exports. A political argument which solves the economic problem, which is a political economy of ethnicity. The political economy of ethnicity says that there are ethnic brethren across the next valley, across the next mountain, right? Whereas in fact, what you need is the next valley and the next mountain, because in the economics that you're living in, territory is the thing that counts. So you have a kind of marriage of political economy and ethnic nationalism. There's another problem which Serbia and then Greece and then Romania and then Bulgaria and then all the rest face, and that is the problem of limited sovereignty. Because the nation state comes into the world, I mean, despite the myths, it's not born fully sovereign. It comes into the world as an extension of the imperial system. So at the beginning, you know, the European great powers looking at Greece, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, they were thinking of them not as independent sovereign equal states, of course. They were thinking of them as players on the chessboard to be moved around, part of a buttress of the imperial system. Not something which is going to undo the imperial system. And when this all changes is in 1912, 1913, 1914, with the First Balkan War, the Second Baltic War, and the Third Baltic War, a Third Baltic War otherwise known as the First World War, in which the Balkan states in a coalition actually managed to defeat the Ottoman Empire, right, which is never supposed to happen. You're not supposed to defeat an empire. And they do it in opposition to the wishes of their imperial patrons, which is very important because in this way, simplifying the story, they recreate themselves as fully sovereign states. And the First World War starts because Serbia, essentially, I'm simplifying a bit, tries the same kind of thing against the Habsburg monarchy that had succeeded against the Ottoman Empire, which sets off a great war. Now, the irony of the Great War, one of the many ironies of the Great War, is that the Great War ends with a Serbian intellectual victory. It ends with a Serbian victory on many fronts, but it ends with a Serbian intellectual victory around the world. This basic anti-colonial or anti-imperial idea of national self-determination is picked up by everyone over the course of the First World War. Not just the stereotypically naive Americans, but also by, boy, these American jokes are really working a bit too well. And the American diplomats are laughing the loudest. This is what has me worried. Okay, not just the Americans and Woodrow Wilson and his righteousness, but also Vladimir Lenin and his Russian Revolution, but also the Germans. Who, when they win the war at the East and they set treaty terms at Brest-Litovsk, also talk about national self-determination, also talk about how they're going to create a Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, Belarusian, Ukrainian states. So the point is that there's an intellectual victory of this decolonial idea, and if you follow me this far, then you can also follow me to the next step, which is that this idea can't work for much the same reasons that it had problems in the 19th century. The states are too small, they've all come out of bigger internal markets, right? Austria is a great example. Austria in the 20s and 30s, ladies and gentlemen, is a paradigmatic East European state. You only get to be West European later on. In the 20s and 30s, you were just as East European as they come. Agrarian, nobody thinks that you can exist, no nationality of your own. You cease to exist before the interwar period is over. What else is there? Oh, end of democracy, coup, funny uniforms in the official regime. Like, you have it all. You're an East European state in the 20s and 30s, right? So I'm not just talking to you, I'm talking to you. So there's an intellectual victory in the 20s and 30s, and it has the same weaknesses that this model has in the 19th century, namely that you lose access to the big markets, and you, in the case of this part of the world, which I want to focus on now, you don't have access to patrons. So the British, the French, the Americans, of course, are the victors in the First World War, the ones who are supposed to be supporting self-determination. They're far away. They're not in a position to prop up this order, which leads to the intellectual and then the political move, which brings us closer to today's Ukraine, and which I think is very interesting of itself, which is the import of colonialism back into Europe itself, okay? So what happens in the 1920s and especially the 1930s is that European leaders, two in particular, take ideas that were in a way normal or more or less normal in the rest of the world, Africa, North America, and apply them to Europeans with radical consequences, okay? So one of these leaders, one of these neo-colonial ideas is Stalinism. Is the idea of taking, now I will quote Stalin, taking the territory and the people of the Soviet Union and treating it as an internal colony. Stalin's argument, and this I'm now quoting, I'm going to get the quotation somewhat wrong, but it's basically like this. We lack, comrades, says Stalin, we lack access to a maritime empire like our enemies have. Therefore, we must use the land and people of our own territory as the British and the French use their empires. We must create an internal colony. Okay? So the idea there, of course, is, as you all know, is to modernize the Soviet Union by exploiting an essentially agrarian population, the land and the people, to create mines and factories and big cities. And of course, the key territory in this project is Ukraine. Right, because Ukraine is the agrarian heartland of the Soviet Union. From the point of view of the theory, there is the most to be extracted from Ukraine, and in practice, it's Ukraine that suffers the most in the famine of 1932 and 1933. The other idea, which is a kind of internal colonization, and is actually conceived as such, is of course National Socialism. Okay, so what does Hitler say about the relationship between Germans to the Slavs? What Hitler says is that we will treat the Ukrainians like Africans, and his idea of how Europeans treated Africans is actually quite fantastic, even compared to the reality. Hitler said, I'm just going to give you a couple of samples so you get the flavor of this. Hitler said that when we conquer Ukraine, we will put a loudspeaker up on a post in the middle of the village, and then once a week the villagers will dance around it, and they will be happy. Hitler said, when we go to Ukraine, we will give them beads, because this is what colonial peoples like. So this is the idea. And what's interesting from our point of view, right, is a European not seeing Europeans as Europeans, right, or as Americans would say, white people, not seeing Europeans as Europeans, but seeing Europeans in a racist way. But in a racist way, and Hannah Arendt made this argument a long time ago, in a racist way which is made possible by the experience of Africa and also indirectly the experience of North America. And again, in this case, Ukraine is the central territory. So what does this encounter, what do these two neo-colonial ideas mean? In practice, they mean two things. They mean, first of all, a consensus that nation states are basically bogus. And so in a series of events which I can't really describe, but which are very interesting, beginning with the Anschluss of Austria in 1938 and continuing until the beginning of the German-Soviet War in 1941, the European order is destroyed. It's destroyed by destroying states. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Poland are all destroyed by German or by German-Soviet initiative over this period before the war between the Germans and the Soviets began. So they bring a state order to an end, which makes sense if you're thinking colonially. Why should there be states? The second thing which happens is the German-Soviet War of 1941, which before all else is a war over Ukraine. Stalin has read Mein Kampf and he knows that Hitler is after Ukraine. He's right. Hitler is in fact after Ukraine. Above all things, the war is for Ukraine, and to a large extent it is fought in Ukraine. And to make a long story, which I tell in Bloodlands, very short, this means that there is no more dangerous place to be in the world than Ukraine between 1933 and 1945. Now, this leads me to, if you'll follow me this far, this leads me to a way to discuss European integration and the EU project, which is maybe a bit different than what we're used to, but which might bring us closer to the contemporary Russian and Ukrainian positions on the question, and in my view, therefore, to reality. There is a story, there is a story about how European integration arose, which I'm just going to dismiss, and then we can talk about it later. The story is that Europeans learned things from the Second World War, okay? I do not believe this at all. Not in the sense that it's now meant, that Europeans learned that war was a bad thing, okay? So certainly the Soviet Union, which suffered the most from the Second World War, did not learn that war was a bad thing from the Second World War. The Poles, who suffered the second most in absolute terms, did not draw the conclusion that we should all be pacifists. The Jews who founded Israel, ditto, right? The population, which in proportional terms as a population suffered by far the worst, did not draw the conclusion that we should all be pacifists, right? And nor did the West Europeans. The West Europeans drew this conclusion only after losing a whole series of colonial wars which stretched out over the course of a generation, at which point they said, oh yes, we learned a lesson from the Second World War, right? That everything should be peaceful. Now, this is a serious point, because if we think of losing colonial wars as the crucial thing, rather than like Europeans being wise, as this is my like Republican moment, if we think of not about it in terms of Europeans being wise and smart and pacifist, right, but instead in terms of losing colonial wars, then you have the key to a different narrative which allows certain things to fall into place. Because what happens in 1945, of course, is that Europe's greatest power, Europe's best army, Europe's most impressive economy, and so on, loses a colonial war. The German defeat to the Red Army is the most dramatic, and of course the final loss, not final, it's the only one in Europe. It's the first and last major colonial war inside Europe, where a European power loses a colonial war. It's defined as a colonial war at the time, and they lose it dramatically. And if you're the Federal Republic of Germany, then European integration, going to France, going to Luxembourg, going to Belgium, and so on, makes sense as a substitute project, right? And we should not think about this in terms of Franco-German, because I mean, the French, remember, more French fought on the Axis side than on the Allied side, right? So they lost the Second World War twice versus an ally, and then on the Axis side. So it's not this story of Franco-German integration as like a victor, and that doesn't actually make any sense, right? I mean, if you look straight at the history of Vichy, this doesn't make any sense. What does make sense is European integration as a place to go when your colonies fail, when your colonies go away. And then if you look at the Germans and also the Italians, you see European powers who lose colonies in the Second World War. And then if you follow the history of European integration after that, right, through the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, forgive me for getting it out of order, you see that you have one great power after another which loses its colonies but finds a home economically and eventually politically inside the European Union. So what I want to submit is that the European Union cannot really be understood, although of course, I mean, this is a myth which I cannot stop, but it cannot really be understood, because it's a nice myth, it cannot really be understood as learning lessons from the Second World War. It is a place to go when the colonial wars are lost, be that in Europe or be that somewhere else. Now, this means that Europe, the EU, is a solution to something. It's not a solution to the Second World War, it's a solution to something. It's a solution to Europeans losing colonial wars, which is not as much, it's not as pleasant a story to tell, right? Because it's not as moralizing, because I mean, A, generally people think colonial wars are bad now, and B, whether they're bad or not, it's never pleasant to lose wars, right? You'd rather they be good and that you win them than they be bad and that you lose them. And so, war bad and we lost it is not a good place to have a myth, right? That we don't like war at all, that's a good place to have a myth. So that's where your myth is. But in terms of the reality, I think what's happened has much more to do with colonialism. And in that sense, the European Union becomes something more interesting because global, right? In the sense that it is where European politics and European political and economic energy focuses after things are lost. So it's a place where you can go when your empire is lost. And then once it's created, the neutrals, right, Austria, Sweden, and so on, then can join later on. Now, this means, if this is right, this means something very interesting for the enlargements of 1989. Okay, so the enlargements of 1989, the enlargements of the European Union in 2004, 2007, which include the states of this gray zone. So not Austria, not Yugoslavia, but in general, the entire East European gray zone, which is created after 1918. This is interesting because it means that what I'm calling the inherently untenable nation states, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Baltic states, Hungary, they also have a place to go, right? And the place they have to go is the European Union. And after 1989, or even before, what their elites are all saying is, we want to return to Europe. And what people in the European Union are generally saying is, what are you talking about? We have Maastricht, common currency, if you could just wait for a couple of generations, maybe we can start talking. This is forgotten. But in 1989, practically no one in Western Europe was inviting the East Europeans to join, and generally people looked at Eastern Europe then, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, much as many Europeans look at Ukraine now. It's something totally different, it's far away, it's never going to join, and so on and so forth. So what's interesting about those enlargements is that these enlargements are, you've already see what I'm going to say. These enlargements are a solution to the problem of the nation state, right? Because the nation state is not tenable. It's not tenable on either side, okay? So it's not tenable to form a nation state from an empire, like, say, Serbia or Poland. But it's also not tenable to form a nation state when you were the empire, i.e. Great Britain from the British Empire, or France from the French Empire, or Germany from what was supposed to be the German Empire. Either way, it's untenable. There is no history of the European nation state. It never happened. It's an organizing principle which rests on nothing. There was never an age of the nation state. It simply never happened. The moment that nation states formed, they immediately become problematic, fall apart, start wars, get absorbed in empires, or, in the case that we have now, join the European Union. So what's interesting about the integrations after 1989 is they prove that the EU is a place to go after empire, not just for the former imperial powers, right? But also for the former colonized states. It's a home, I'm not going to say it's a rest home, although I'm tempted. It's a home for countries to go after empire, regardless of which side of empire you were on, which to my mind makes it all the more elegant and powerful and extraordinary as a political achievement, that it can house both kinds of states. Because of course the history of having an empire and being part of an empire are actually very different histories. And the fact that it's all in Europe together sometimes blurs, or optically blurs, that difference for us. Now, if this is, I'm going to draw this now to a close, but if this is the right way to think about European history, if the Ukrainian-Russian war helps us to see European history, what then do we say when we turn our vision back to Russia and Ukraine? And we notice something very, very interesting if we just think about borders for a moment, and that is this. I'm claiming that the European Union has become a home for former West European, basically maritime empires, right? I'm also claiming it's become a home for the countries, the nation states that were formed out of land empires. But there is a line that the European Union has not yet crossed. And that line is the border between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe as of 1922. So there are former, don't get me wrong, there are former Soviet states in the EU, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. There are former communist states in the EU, of course. But the territory that was in the Soviet Union in 1922 when the Soviet Union was founded, the territory, in other words, which experienced the first round of Stalinism, collectivization, the Great Terror, not a square centimeter of that territory has joined the European Union. So here is the real question, right? Whether post-Stalinist, if you like, territory can join the European Union. Because the Baltics and Poland, with all due respect, are a bit of a different case. What I'm talking about now is what is now central and eastern Ukraine, central and eastern Belarus, all of Russia, and the rest. That is a line which the European Union has not crossed, and it's that line which I would say is now the line which, where European political power is now being contested, which is where I want to close. If this argument is true, what it means for politics is that it is actually impossible for the history or the politics of the EU, for that matter, to end at any given border. What you cannot say about the history of Europe then is that the history of Europe has something to do with the permanence of linguistic or ethnic or cultural or even state borders, because all those things have changed. The only thing which seems to be durable is the general business of integration and disintegration along different lines, where the EU project of integration has solved some of the problems of previous projects of integration, because of course the empire is a kind of integration. The nation state is also a kind of integration. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that my integration is your disintegration, right? If I want to make a Serbian state on your Habsburg territory, my integration is your disintegration, which is where we are now on a higher level, right? Because in seeking to disintegrate the Ukrainian state, Russian elites are not after the Ukrainian state, they're after the general European project of integration, because they understand, they may not buy all the history that I've given you, but they understand where it leads. They understand this particular political logic. The second conclusion that I want to draw from this is that it's a version of the same point, really. Ukraine cannot be a buffer state, right? So I think one lazy move that we like to make in our sleep is, okay, so fine, Ukraine, it's there, we admit it's there, it's okay, but maybe it could just be a buffer between Russia and Europe. Wouldn't that be nice? This actually, I think, cannot happen, because if European integration is a logic of the kind that I'm talking about, then Ukrainians, or eventually also others, Belarusians, are always going to be interested in it insofar as they're interested in securing their own state. That is, the European logic, because it's about strengthening your own state, it can't be contained within that state, because people in the state are always going to look out to Europe. And likewise, even if, here's a real practical policy thing, even if the European Union leaders were to wake up tomorrow, and Merkel were to wake up tomorrow and to say, Chancellor Merkel were to wake up tomorrow and say, yes, President Putin, you can have Ukraine, that would not stop any of this, right? Because the Russians leaders would continue to understand the European Union in the way that I'm talking about. They would continue to understand that the European Union has a way of strengthening states, whereas what they're after is weakening states. So there is no move that you can make which actually stops this dynamic. This history goes on, which leads to the conclusion, which was really just the introduction, which is that I think in the end, we have something to learn both from Russian foreign policy and from Ukrainian domestic policy. That on both sides they are absolutely right that the stakes are Europe, that the stakes are not local, but the stakes are Europe, and that the Ukrainians aren't going to win without Europe winning, and the Russians aren't going to win without Europe losing. That is what they keep telling us, and what I'm trying to do is to give you a historical background which might convince you that this is actually the case. And if I could just close by making a slightly more specific point. What's interesting about Ukraine, if you want to think of it as interesting, it's not just that you can do what I did at the beginning and make European history more interesting by adding Ukraine, or it's not just that you can be polite to Ukrainians by saying, oh yes, you had a renaissance and so on and so forth, right? It's not just that. It is actually the case, it is truly the case, that if you don't get Ukraine now, if you don't understand Ukraine now, you are not understanding the basic tendencies of European history as they are affecting you now and into the future. Okay, thank you very much.